The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when they found her, barefoot, pale, and trembling at the edge of the woods. The storm had washed half the mountain road away, but she stood there anyway, as if waiting for someone who'd never come. Her hair hung in thick, tangled ropes, the color of old straw, and her eyes, hollow gray, didn't blink when the headlights struck her. She looked no older than 9, but what froze the men in their tracks wasn't her face. It was her stomach. The first discovery began with a mistake. A lone hiker named David Crane had wandered too far off the marked trail somewhere deep in the Appalachian foothills, the sun dying behind the thick canopy of trees. His phone battery blinked red, his map soaked from the rain, and his breath came out in ragged clouds as twilight crept in. He wasn't looking for anything, only a shortcut back to the main road, but the woods had other plans. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That was when he saw the faint shape ahead, just beyond a curtain of fog, a small, weathered cabin crouched between the trees like a wounded animal. Its windows were blackened, its door slightly ajar, and smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Everything about it looked dead, yet something inside told him not to leave. He called out, his voice cracking against the silence. No answer came, only the whisper of rain sliding off the roof. As he stepped onto the porch, the wood moaned under his weight, and for a moment, he thought the cabin might collapse. Then he noticed movement, a small figure standing at the edge of the porch, half hidden by the shadow of the doorframe. At first, he thought it was a doll someone had left behind. But then it moved. A girl, no taller than his waist, barefoot and shivering, her skin pale as bone and her dress clinging wet to her thin body. Her hair hung over her face, tangled and matted, dripping with rainwater. She didn't speak. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, staring up at him with eyes too old for her face. David's throat tightened as he knelt down, asking if she was lost or hurt. She didn't answer, but when he reached out his hand, her arms instinctively curled around her stomach. It was then he saw it, the unmistakable swell beneath the fabric, a roundness that did not belong to a child her age. For a moment, he couldn't move. The wind howled through the trees, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The girl whispered something, barely audible over the rain, a word that might have been a name or a warning. Her eyes darted toward the door behind her, and David followed her gaze, realizing with sudden dread that the darkness inside wasn't empty. There was movement, a faint rustle, a creak of footsteps too heavy to be hers. When he turned back, the girl was gone, swallowed by the mist, leaving only her small muddy footprints leading into the woods and the echo of that single word still clinging to the rain-soaked air. By the time the sheriff reached the old cabin the next morning, the storm had quieted into a mist that clung to the treetops like breath on glass. Sheriff Amos Leary had lived his whole life in those hills, seen more than a few strange things, but something about the hiker's story from the night before gnawed at him. A barefoot girl, pregnant, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, that wasn't something a man could forget. He brought Deputy Ross with him, a younger man with steady hands but eyes that darted at every sound. Their boots squelched through the mud as they pushed deeper into the forest, the air heavy with the smell of wet pine and decay. When they finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked even older than the hiker described, slumped and rotting, its porch sagging like the spine of something long dead. The sheriff called out, his voice low but firm, expecting silence. Instead, a faint echo came back, not from the cabin, but from somewhere deeper in the trees. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight. The door hung half open, scraping against the floor as he pushed it wider. The air inside was thick, stale, and wrong. Dust clung to the walls in spiderweb strands, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, as if someone had tried to start a fire days ago but never finished. A few old jars sat on a shelf, filled with something cloudy and unidentifiable. A broken cradle rested in the corner, one leg splintered clean off. Ross found footprints in the mud just outside the back door, small, bare ones that led toward the creek, then vanished. "Could be the girl," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff nodded but didn't answer. He'd seen something else, a faint streak of red smeared along the edge of the wooden doorframe, the kind that only came from skin meeting splinters too fast. He followed the marks to a corner of the room where a piece of fabric was caught under a loose floorboard. He bent down and pulled it free. It was a strip of faded cotton, torn from a child's dress, the same kind of pale blue the hiker had described. They searched the area for hours, calling her name though they didn't know it. But the woods gave nothing back. The birds stayed quiet, the creek ran black with rainwater, and the wind carried a strange hum, almost human. When they finally left, the sheriff took one last look at the cabin and noticed something he'd missed before: a small, hand-carved toy sitting on the windowsill, freshly made, its wooden surface still smooth from recent touch. It was a cradle. Inside it lay a single, tiny bundle of hair tied neatly with twine. When Sheriff Leary returned to town, the unease followed him like a shadow. He couldn't shake the image of that tiny cradle, the torn blue fabric, the silence that pressed against his ears inside that rotting cabin. Something about it felt old, older than the cabin itself, older than the town. The next morning, he went to the county records office, a dusty little room tucked behind the courthouse where forgotten files slept under layers of dust. The clerk, an elderly man named Clyde Henson, looked up with a mix of curiosity and irritation as the sheriff requested any property records for a cabin off Ridge Hollow Road. Clyde grumbled but pulled out a stack of old ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed and brittle. It didn't take long before he found it, a name that hadn't been spoken in decades. Halloway. The sheriff frowned. He'd heard that name before, whispered in stories told by old-timers after too much whiskey. The Halloways were said to have lived deep in the hills long before the county had paved roads or put up fences. No one knew exactly how many of them there were, only that they kept to themselves and never left the mountains. People said their bloodline was pure, that they didn't trust outsiders, that they had no need to marry beyond their own kin. The stories had always sounded like mountain folklore, tales to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But the records in front of him told another story: births, deaths, marriages, all under the same last name, repeating over generations like an echo that never faded. The last entry was dated 1962. It listed 3 names: William Halloway, his sister Margaret, and a child simply marked as infant, female. No one had filed a death record for any of them. The sheriff asked Clyde what had happened to the family, but the old man only shrugged, saying they disappeared after the flood that year. Some claimed their house had washed away, others that they left when the government tried to buy their land. But there was one detail that made Leary's stomach turn: the property on record matched the exact location of the cabin he'd just visited. As he closed the ledger, a chill crawled through him. The girl the hiker found couldn't have been more than 9. If the last recorded child from that family was born over 60 years ago, then who was she? That question stayed with him long after he left the courthouse, echoing louder with every passing hour, until it began to sound less like curiosity and more like warning, something ancient and breathing that refused to stay buried in the past. The photograph was found by accident. After the discovery of the Halloway name in the old records, Sheriff Leary returned to the cabin with Deputy Ross, determined to dig deeper this time. The morning air was colder, the fog heavier, wrapping around the trees like it was hiding something. They moved carefully, flashlights cutting through the dim interior as dust floated like ash in their beams. The cabin looked just as they had left it, silent, still, but with the unmistakable feeling that someone had been there since. One of the chairs had been moved slightly, its legs dragging faint grooves through the grime on the floor. The sheriff noticed it immediately. He crouched beside it, tracing the lines, then followed them toward a small dresser wedged against the back wall. Its drawers were swollen shut from moisture, but after a hard pull, the top one gave way with a groan. Inside was a stack of old papers, a few rusted utensils, and beneath them, wrapped in a strip of oilcloth, a photograph. It was black and white, edges curled and spotted with age, but the image itself was clear. A man and a little girl stood side by side in front of the very same cabin. The man had a gaunt, hollow face, the kind that seemed stretched too thin over bone, and a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. The girl stood beside him, barefoot, wearing the same kind of blue dress the hiker had described. Her expression was vacant, her small hand gripping the man's arm like she didn't know what else to do. But what stopped the sheriff cold wasn't their pose, it was their faces. The man's features were wrong in a way he couldn't quite name. The longer he stared, the more he realized that the man and the child shared the same eyes, the same slope of the nose, even the same faint scar above the lip. They didn't just look related. They looked identical, as though the child was a smaller mirror of the man himself. Ross noticed it too and muttered under his breath, asking if it could be some kind of old photo trick. But Leary shook his head. There was no trick in the exhaustion etched into the man's eyes or the unnatural familiarity between the two. It was as if the same blood had folded over itself too many times, erasing the difference between parent and child. When the sheriff turned the photograph over, there was something written on the back in faded pencil. 2 words. My daughter. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the writing, but what unsettled him most was that the letters seemed written by a trembling hand that had formed those same words again and again, each attempt shakier than the last, as if the writer wasn't sure who they were claiming as their own. By the end of that week, the story of the cabin had already begun to spread through the nearby town, whispered in low voices at the diner and along the gas station counter. No one wanted to talk too loudly about it, but everyone knew something had been found up there that shouldn't have been. And when the sheriff's office started asking questions about the Halloways, the woods themselves seemed to tighten their grip on the truth. It started with the sounds, strange, drifting noises that carried through the trees once the sun went down. People living near Ridge Hollow said they'd hear it sometime after midnight, when the air turned still and the crickets went silent. At first, it sounded like the wind moving through the pines, soft and almost human. But then it grew clearer, closer. A faint humming, like a lullaby sung through closed lips, followed by the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Most dismissed it as imagination. The mind, they said, plays tricks when fear settles in. But others swore they'd heard it too, and not just once. Hunters came back shaken, saying they'd followed the sound only to find nothing but fog and the faint smell of burning wood. One man claimed he'd seen a figure moving between the trees, a girl, barefoot, carrying something bundled in her arms. He shouted to her, but she vanished into the mist without a sound. The next morning, he found tiny footprints by the creek, pressed deep into the mud, leading nowhere. The sheriff returned to the area one evening with a search team, hoping to catch whoever was trespassing near the cabin. They set up near the ridge as the light faded, their radios crackling with static. Hours passed, and the forest grew quiet, unnaturally quiet, until one of the men whispered that he heard it. The humming. It came from deeper in the woods, low and trembling, like someone singing to soothe a child. Leary held his breath, listening. The voice was soft, feminine, and heartbreakingly calm. Then came the wail of an infant, sharp and distant. The men moved toward it, flashlights trembling, but the moment they stepped into the hollow, the sound stopped. When the sheriff looked down, he saw a small wooden toy lying in the leaves, a tiny rattle carved from oak, old and smooth from touch. Beside it was a single thread from a blue dress, snagged on a thorn. He pocketed both quietly, saying nothing to the others. But that night, back in town, as he emptied his coat, he could swear he still heard that faint lullaby playing somewhere just beyond the walls, soft and slow, as if it had followed him home from the woods. It was an old woman who came forward first, her name barely legible on the yellowing town census. Mrs. Eunice Weller had lived her entire life on the edge of the forest, in a sagging farmhouse with boarded windows and a chimney that hadn't smoked in years. When Sheriff Leary arrived to question her, she was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, her thin hands folded in her lap, eyes hidden behind round, fogged glasses. She didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, she seemed to be waiting. The sheriff showed her the photograph from the cabin, and for a long moment she said nothing, just stared at it until her lips began to tremble. Then she whispered, almost to herself, that she had seen that cabin before, many years ago, before anyone in town dared to speak the name Halloway out loud. She told him she used to be a midwife back then, when people still called her in the middle of the night with lanterns and wagons, asking her to deliver babies that weren't supposed to exist. The Halloways, she said, had come to her 3 times, each time sending a different man but always with the same woman, thin and silent, her face covered by a shawl. They never let her near the cabin in daylight. She'd be blindfolded, taken through the woods, and brought into the house only when the cries of the mother could no longer be ignored. She said the children were always wrong somehow. Not sick, exactly, but unnatural, born too pale, with limbs that twisted slightly or eyes that didn't blink right. None of them cried much after birth. They just watched, as if they already knew too much. Mrs. Weller's voice shook as she spoke, her fingers clutching at the edges of her blanket. The last time she went up there, she said, the woman didn't survive. The men told her it didn't matter, that the blood would carry on regardless. She'd tried to report it, but no one believed her. They said she'd been seeing things, that no such family lived up there anymore. So she stopped talking about it, shut her doors, and waited for time to bury what she'd seen. But time, she said, never buried anything in those woods, it only pressed it deeper. When the sheriff asked her what the children looked like, she hesitated, then said softly that they all looked the same, every one of them, no matter who the father was supposed to be. She said their faces mirrored each other, as if the family had been copying itself for generations until the blood no longer knew where it began or ended. Then she leaned close and told him the part that chilled him most, that the girl the hiker found sounded just like the last baby she delivered, the one she swore had died more than 50 years ago. It was near the end of summer when the girl returned. The townsfolk had almost convinced themselves she was a story, something invented to explain the strange noises that haunted the woods. But one evening, just before dusk, a farmer named Clyde Perkins saw her walking down the dirt road behind his property. He'd been repairing a fence when he caught sight of a small figure emerging from the tree line, barefoot, moving slowly as if she didn't quite belong in her own body. At first, he thought she was lost again, maybe one of the children from town playing in the wrong place. But as she drew closer, the air around him seemed to change. He swore it grew colder, quieter, like the wind itself had stopped to watch. She looked exactly as the sheriff had described her months earlier, thin, pale, her hair tangled and her blue dress torn at the hem. But this time she wasn't alone. She held something in her arms, cradling it close to her chest, a bundle wrapped in stained, crimson cloth. Clyde called out to her, his voice trembling despite himself, asking if she was hurt. She didn't answer. She just kept walking, slow and steady, her eyes fixed ahead as if following some path only she could see. When she passed within a few feet of him, he caught the smell, a mix of damp earth, rot, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. That was when he realized what she was holding. It wasn't a doll. It was a baby. He froze, unable to speak. The girl finally looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes made his stomach twist. There was no fear, no sadness, only a dull, knowing calm, the kind that comes from something ancient and unbroken. The baby in her arms didn't move, but Clyde swore he heard it make a faint, wheezing sound, as if drawing its first breath. He stumbled back, tripping over the fence post behind him, and by the time he got to his feet, the girl was already gone, swallowed by the trees. When he ran into town to tell the sheriff, his words barely made sense. Leary gathered a small team and searched the road until sunrise, but there was no trace, no footprints, no sound, nothing but a few strands of straw-colored hair caught in the thorns. Still, every witness told the same story: the girl was real, the baby was real, and both had come back from a place that no longer belonged to the living. From that night on, the cries in the woods grew louder, carrying farther, until even the bravest men refused to go near Ridge Hollow after dark. The revelation came in the sterile hum of the county lab, fluorescent lights reflecting off metal countertops and microscopes. Sheriff Leary had insisted that the girl and the baby be examined, if only to confirm what he already feared but dared not voice. The lab technicians were quiet at first, scribbling notes and adjusting slides, but as the DNA results came back, the room grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were recoiling. The first test confirmed what everyone had guessed from her appearance: the girl's age, the child's age, nothing unusual there. But the second test, the one that compared the DNA of mother and child, sent shivers crawling down every spine in the room. The results were impossible. The girl's child carried identical markers to both the mother and the father, a genetic mirroring that defied reason. The technicians double-checked, triple-checked, running the tests over again, but the results were consistent. The father, identified through distant relatives and town records, was a man whose family tree traced directly back to the Halloways. He had never married outside the bloodline, and his ancestry was so tightly folded upon itself that each generation looked nearly identical. The implication was horrifying and undeniable: the girl had been impregnated by someone whose genetic code was so entwined with hers that the line between parent and sibling, husband and child, had effectively collapsed. Sheriff Leary felt his stomach churn as he read the final report, the words heavy on the paper like a sentence already passed. He'd seen strange things in these mountains, but nothing that felt this deliberate, this unnatural. DNA didn't lie, and yet his mind screamed against the logic of it. The girl was 9. The baby was hers. And the father was so closely related that the scientists refused to call it anything other than inbred, pure and horrifying in a way that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The implications spread like a shadow over the office. The girl's identity, the child's survival, the Halloway legacy, it all converged into a single, terrible truth that no one wanted to face. Questions that once seemed distant now demanded answers. How long had this been happening, hidden in the woods, beneath the weight of fog and secrecy? How many generations had been folded into themselves, repeating the same cycle of twisted genetics, until the line between father and daughter, uncle and niece, became meaningless. Even the technicians, used to examining anomalies, avoided looking directly at each other after reading the results. Something about the quiet, sterile room, normally neutral and clinical, had shifted. It felt alive, as if the forest itself had sent its secret through the wires and glass, confirming everything the sheriff had feared. Leary left the lab that night with the report clutched in his hands, unable to shake the image of the girl and her baby, and the knowledge that the child she carried was not only a product of this hidden family, but a mirror of its darkest, most inescapable history. The fire started in the dead of night, a flicker at first, barely noticeable against the dark silhouette of the cabin. Neighbors spotted it from their porches, a faint orange glow crawling through the fog, and by the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the building was already consumed. Flames licked at the timbers, thick smoke rolling into the hills, black and choking. Sheriff Leary and Deputy Ross were first on the scene, sirens silent as the fire roared louder than the wind. The heat was unbearable even from a distance, and the smell of burning wood mixed with something fouler, something metallic that made them gag. People said it was an accident, an old cabin succumbing to decay. But the sheriff knew better. He had walked those floors, touched those walls, and seen things no one should see. There was intention behind this blaze. They watched the fire burn, men in heavy coats shifting uneasily, when movement caught Leary's eye. He swore he saw figures standing in the flames, silhouettes framed by firelight. At first, he thought it was smoke playing tricks, dancing shadows that mimicked human form. But as the fire grew hotter, the figures remained, hands clasped together, faces upturned, smiling. Their shapes were small and large, child and adult, but unnaturally still, almost statuesque, glowing like embers themselves. The sight turned his stomach cold, and Ross, following his gaze, murmured something about hallucinations. But Leary knew he hadn't imagined it. People who came later claimed the same thing. One elderly man said he saw a girl standing on the porch, holding a tiny bundle close to her chest, while a taller figure lingered behind her, its face hidden but its posture impossibly proud. Northwest one dared get close. The fire seemed alive, resisting attempts to douse it, consuming only what it chose, leaving the earth and trees around it mostly untouched. By dawn, the cabin was nothing but charred ruins, yet eyewitnesses swore the figures had disappeared only after the flames died down, vanishing into the morning mist like smoke through fingers. Inside the burnt remains, the sheriff found pieces of wood and scorched earth arranged strangely, almost deliberately. A single strip of the blue dress, burned at the edges but otherwise intact, lay near the corner where the cradle once stood. The smell of ash clung to everything, but underneath it, he caught that same faint, metallic scent, blood, or something like it. It was as if the cabin itself had tried to keep a memory alive, leaving behind the smallest traces, so that anyone who came looking would understand that this family, this line of twisted inheritance, had not ended, could not end. Even after the fire, whispers persisted. Locals swore the humming returned at night, low and slow, carrying through the hills as if the fire had only freed the voices trapped inside. And in the minds of those who saw it, the figures in the flames remained, hand in hand, smiling in a way no living person ever could. When the investigators finally returned to the site months later, the charred remains of the cabin had settled into the earth like a wound slowly scabbing over. Sheriff Leary and a team of forensic specialists had brought shovels, metal detectors, and an uneasy resolve. The locals had warned them, saying some things in the woods were better left alone, but the evidence of the girl and her child demanded answers. They began to dig around the foundation, where the cabin had once pressed against the soil, the earth dark and loose from the rain. At first, it seemed like nothing but mud and roots, but soon, their tools struck something solid, a small, rough wooden box buried just beneath the floorboards. Inside the box were fragments of life long forgotten. Tiny bones, brittle with age, arranged in a way that suggested care, almost reverence. There were pieces of clothing, faded to gray, and miniature cradles, some splintered, others still intact, their wood worn smooth from generations of use. Each item was numbered crudely, carved into the wood with a knife, and marked with the same single word, *ours. The investigators felt a chill run through them as they realized that this was no ordinary family burial. The Halloways, it seemed, had kept their history beneath the very floors they lived on, preserving every child, every life, every twisted continuation of their bloodline. As they dug deeper, more tunnels revealed themselves, narrow and claustrophobic, carved by hands that must have known the land as intimately as their own bodies. The passageways wound beneath the foundation like veins, carrying the remains of generations. Some tunnels led to hidden chambers, where piles of clothing, dolls, and carved wooden figures rested in eerie stillness, each a silent witness to lives that had never seen the outside world. The air inside smelled faintly of decay and earth, yet carried a strange, almost intoxicating calm, as if the family had left some imprint of themselves, a lingering presence that refused to leave even after death. The team catalogued everything carefully, but even in photographs and notes, the horror of what they found could not be contained. DNA tests confirmed the ages and identities of some remains, but many were too degraded to fully analyze. It became clear that this was a cycle that had continued for decades, each generation feeding into the next, buried beneath the foundation, hidden from the world but never forgotten by the forest itself. Sheriff Leary felt the weight of it pressing against him, a history of suffering, secrecy, and unnatural continuation that no one in the town could have imagined. The tunnels seemed endless, their dark paths whispering a truth that had waited too long to be revealed, and as the team worked quietly in the fading light, it became impossible to ignore the feeling that the Halloway story was not yet finished, that something, or someone, was still waiting in the shadows to reclaim what had always been theirs.